had some interesting things to look at last night to do with Russia. And in a sense, it's a little bit negative, I guess you could say, because it doesn't have necessarily the happiest ending, you could say, last night. But tonight, we're going to look at peace, peace in the Middle East. And we asked the question, will it ever come? And spoiler alert, we're going to have a happy ending. So we asked the question, will peace ever come? And I know, and you know, naturally in the Middle East, honestly, no. It's been going on for how long, and there is seemingly no end to the conflict that's going on there. And right now, you could argue maybe it's worse than it's ever been. It is, the whole region is in turmoil. We've seen it spread through what was originally something that people were getting excited about, the Arab Spring, thinking that all of a sudden democracy was going to spread across the region, and unicorns and rainbows were going to be seen on every hill. And it just simply has not been the case. It has gone from bad to worse. And now we see it in Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and now we finished last night by looking at the things that are starting to turn up to a bit more of a hot, maybe not quite boiling yet, but certainly a level of hot in Turkey. So across the whole region, we can see that peace is far from close, it would seem. Tonight we're going to focus a little bit more on the events in Israel, because it's simply what the world focuses on. It seems almost disproportionately the world focuses on Israel, but it is the case. And the Bible also focuses on Israel. So tonight we will be looking primarily at events that have to do with Israel, but it will affect, of course, the whole region, and as we'll see, the whole world. And the truth is, the events in Israel actually hold the key to the peace that we are speaking about. Now, I had the opportunity to go to Israel, and it's a number of years ago now. I've had the opportunity to go twice, and it probably was maybe not something I would have thought to do, but my nephew was 4 years old, and he got leukemia while he was maybe 4 or 5, and there's something, you probably have a similar thing down here in Canada. We have something called the Children's Wish Foundation, where they say to a child that has an illness like that, would you like to go on a trip? Was there anywhere you would like to go? And being that really, at age 5, he'd been just doing the good old Sunday school rounds, nothing seemed more exciting to him than going to Israel. And so he wrote back that he wrote them a letter, and he said he wanted to visit Israel, the land where Jesus was and the land where David was, and on his letter went. And I decided, I was very close to him. I didn't have kids of my own at that point, and I thought, you know what, me and my wife, we'd just been married. We thought, you know what, we're going to go along too. This is going to be really neat, and it was going to be a special time that we could spend with him and the family, so we decided to go. And the minute we landed, you knew it was not a normal place, because we get in a taxi cab, and the driver wasn't great at English, but he spoke to us of his experiences. He was an older guy, and in 1948, when the state of Israel was born, he was a young guy, and so he wasn't able to fight, but he was a runner boy, so I guess he would run messages back and forth, because they didn't do technology like we do today. And then he fought in 1956, he fought again in 1967, and he fought again in 1973. And he had a very heavy heart. This was not a good time. I mean, we can sometimes, when we read the scriptures, you can get this feeling of, oh, wow, God's doing such a great work, and the Jews are going back, and things are happening, and God's working. When you actually go there, it's not quite as rosy as that with everyone. It is everybody in that region is suffering to one degree or another. That's simply the truth. And since I've had that first opportunity, I've grown more interested in the things that are going on there, and thus it took me to meet a gentleman by the name of David Rubin. And I'm just going to read this to you. It's from his book. I met him, but once I met him, I said, okay, I like you, and you're an interesting guy, and I went and bought his book. And this is what he wrote in his book. He said, and this is, I heard it from him in person, and then when I found the quote, I thought, this is perfect. Now I can relay this because I thought it just summed up what we're talking about. He lives in Shiloh, which is a settlement, a Jewish settlement, where, if you recall in your scriptures, the tabernacle used to sit. So he was very excited to go and actually be part of rebuilding Shiloh because he thought it had great significance scripturally. But this is what he says: just taking a brief walk in my neighborhood in Shiloh, we come to the house of the Yerushalmi family, whose 17-year-old son Shmuel was killed in a bus bombing. Several houses further down the block lived Shmuel's friend, 17-year-old Avi Sutton, murdered by terrorists who killed Avi and several other classmates who had been playing on or near their high school basketball court. On that same street is the Kessler family, immigrants from the United States, whose 19-year-old granddaughter, Gila Sarah, was also killed in a bus bombing. It doesn't stop. Just around the corner is the Shoham family, whose 5-month-old baby Yehudi was killed by a rock thrown at his head as he and his parents were driving back from a visit to his grandparents' house. He was resting comfortably in his infant seat when the car was ambushed and the poor baby's fragile skull was smashed. The doctors tried valiantly to revive him, but he died of his wounds after several-day vigil in the hospital's intensive care unit. Walk down the hill from the murdered baby's home and you come to the Apter family, whose son Noam was in the kitchen in his yeshiva, religious seminary, which combines military service with religious studies. He and 3 other fellow students were preparing for the Sabbath meal for the other boys who were sitting in the adjacent dining hall. Suddenly, 2 terrorists from the Islamic Jihad terrorist organization burst in the kitchen, shooting and wounding Noam and the others. Before Noam fell dead on the floor, he reached out and locked the door to the dining hall and threw away his key, thereby saving the lives of close to 100 boys in the dining hall. These are only a few of the many examples of children of Shiloh who have been killed or wounded by the fanatical Islamic terrorism that we are all facing. That man's story is beyond shocking. He himself was actually shot in the leg, and his three-year-old, I think, boy was shot in the neck. They actually both survived that. And he went on to become an activist in Israel and started something called Israel's Children, the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, and simply to try and treat children that have suffered from terror, whether it's from losing family or losing, or a personal hardship that they've gone through from their own wounds. And honestly, it's a very sad situation, but I don't say this simply for an emotional shock value. I think for us living over here, certainly for me living in Canada, this is so distant from what I deal with on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes you read something like that, you just think, I can't even relate to what these people are going through. The one thing we talk about peace in the Middle East, there's something you will have heard time and time and time again, and it's something called the two-state solution. You'll remember they pulled out of the Gaza Strip some years ago, and the idea was that this would in some way relieve the tension, give these people some of their own land. The reality is it's done anything but. All it has done is brought more war and more terror and more hardship to the nation. And the truth is, the leadership is beyond corrupt, and I'm sure we don't want to make it sound like all those people are necessarily one way or the other, but the truth is fanatical Islam has taken over the surrounding areas around Israel, and this is the result. And so what's happened over the last little while is that the idea of a two-state solution is becoming more and more impossible. He writes the following: did Ehud Barak and the rest of the Israeli leadership, these are the ones that discussed originally the two-state solution, leadership, really expect the Hezbollah terrorists to sit politely with their hand folded for 6 years in deep longing for peace? Did Ariel Sharon and his then deputy Ehud Olmert seriously think that the Hamas and the Fatah terrorists would turn their swords into plowshares after Israel's retreat from Gaza? Did the American, European, and other leaders of the West sincerely believe that the Islamic terrorists would begin praying for the peace of Jerusalem, Uncle Sam, and the EU if we only disengaged from them by giving them control of more land from which to attack us? The lessons are clear if we only open our eyes as we sit in our bomb shelters as the missiles fall from the north and the south. And so the reality is, it just is impossible to have a two-state solution. This is something, I didn't come up with this myself. It's from somebody in Israel. I don't know who's put it together, but I've seen it before, and I thought it shows the point very well. The yellow dotted line is today what would be considered the West Bank, and you can see from the top there, from the edge of the West Bank to Netanya, on the shoreline there, is only 15 miles across. It is an impossible width of territory from which you can control, or from militarily which you can hold on to in a time of distress. And from the Jordan River is only 55 kilometers across to the major city centers there, east of Tel Aviv. So it is if you took that land, I mean, as bad as it is in Gaza now, if you put that type of a situation in the West Bank and put all that on the mountains that look out over all the plains of your major cities below, you can imagine how brutal a situation it could be. And when we were over there up on the Golan Heights, you can see it's at the top, it says Ramat HaGolan. That's the Golan Heights that look down above the Sea of Galilee. Previous to 1967, it was held by the Syrians, and all the original bunkers and gun emplacements are still there today, and you can go through and you can walk through them and see them. And all those guns and all that was just looking down over Israel's territory, and farmers plowing the fields were simply trying to plow between bombs, and they had full armored tractors. It was ludicrous. So in 1967, they took those heights, and that's something that the world is pushing Israel to give back, along with the West Bank. Now, what's happened in Syria is a civil war. The reality is, even if you wanted to give it back, you have nobody to give it back to because it's so divided and so ridiculous. And so the Golan Heights, for the moment, seems to be off the table. But the reality is, the same situation would exist in the West Bank if you gave that territory up. And now you've got it close to over 600,000, they say now, Jewish people living in the West Bank that you would have to try and evacuate. And so the U.S. even themselves are seeing that White House, it says here, gives up on the Israeli-Palestinian two-state solution peace deal. I actually think this is a really good thing because we do want peace in the region. Nobody wants to see what's going on over there. And from the prophecies, we looked at it last night, the prophecy of Ezekiel 67 ultimately is about a northern confederacy of nations coming down on Israel. But prior to them coming down, it talks about, in verse 11 of Ezekiel 38, it says, and thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to those that are at rest, dwelling safely, all of them without walls, and having neither bars nor gates. I can tell you, if you go through the West Bank, there's more bars, walls, and gates than you can shake a stick at. So something's got to change over there, and something's going to change over there prior to this Northern Confederacy coming down. How it's going to happen, I cannot tell you. It's going to happen, but even then, when we talk about that level of peace, it's not a great peace because the prophecy carries on to say this Northern Confederacy is going to come down. That being said, we do look for an easement of the situation there, and a two-state solution was never going to bring about peace. It simply wasn't. And we can look at maybe a little bit more why the two-state solution would be pushed. But we know for a fact that it was not going to bring about what the prophecies called for, because we could go through prophecy after prophecy after prophecy, and you've got Jews on the mountains of Israel. In fact, it's one of the biggest signs of the times, as far as I'm concerned, that we're living in the end times. Because the growth of people, of Jewish people that the prophecies have called for, are now living in that West Bank is unbelievable. It is not just little tiny settlements here and there. There is now full towns and full villages all over the place. So it really is fulfilling the prophecies so perfectly. Again, we said it last night, you either see it or it's an eerie coincidence. And honestly, there is not an answer for it that, in my mind, of anything other than a fulfillment of the prophecies. So on a natural level, the situation now is far from great. You've still got Hezbollah rearming. You've got Hamas, from one war to the next. The only thing they do in between seems to be dig more tunnels and, try and get more rockets. You've got Iran dreaming of nuclear weapons. And the PA, which is supposed to be the partner for peace, is continually inciting violence, which we're seeing there today. And they name streets after terrorists. So if somebody blows themselves up, there's a good chance you're going to have a street named after you. And that's just the reality over there. This is not, in my mind, this is not somebody you can make peace with. It's like asking you to make peace with, a street gang. It just simply is not going to be. So many people tell us in the news, you'd think the biggest problem to peace is actually Israel. It certainly is in the heart of a lot of the action that's going on over there. But previous to Israel having this West Bank that we talked about, was there peace? So if this is the issue that God is fulfilling his promises, the Jews are going back to the land, and that is truly the issue, is that these people are living in just the West Bank, which is what you'd think. They say, well, Israel's got to withdraw to the 1967 lines. If you read the news, that's what they keep referring to, the 1967 lines, or 1948, which is even less territory. So if the Jews would just retreat, oh my goodness, it's just going to be beautiful. And everyone, again, you've got unicorns and rainbows. The reality is actually far from the truth. Prior to the state of Israel being born, was a gentleman, that's Hamas firing rockets from Gaza into Israel, but there you go. This is the gentleman that was before the Palestinian Authority. If you go back, this gentleman, the Mufti Haj Amir al-Hussein, was the gentleman that was sort of in control. So if you went before, Arafat kind of took over from him loosely. But if you go back, this was the gentleman that was heading up the land there. And you can see just from the picture's 1,000 words. He was best of friends with the Nazi regime. It was brought out, actually, the Benjamin Netanyahu brought out recently that this gentleman was actually almost behind the final solution that happened in Germany. I don't know to the level, I can't speak to that, but I can say he was definitely involved. He was best of friends with all the top brass of the Nazi regime, and they did discuss ending the Jewish problem, as they looked on it, in Israel or Palestine at the time. And it was obvious what he wanted. And this was prior to the State of Israel. The reality is the State of Israel is not really the problem. Osama bin Laden referred to it and said, this was while he was still alive, referred to it and said that they can't take the fact that the Jews are in the land of Palestine, or whatever I can't think of the name he referred to it, but that this is the problem. They can't take it on any level. The truth is, it's not that if Israel withdrew to the 1967 lines, you'd have peace. It will not. It's not the case. They would take the land. Sure, they would. Would they lay their arms down? No. It's not the problem. From the very beginning, the truth is, any Jews in the land is the problem for them. There is no level that is acceptable, and I believe that truly. So, there's the interesting thing when you come to the Middle East, and when you come especially to Israel, there are so many different people that have interests there. I mean, when you go to Jerusalem, you stand in one spot, you've got the churches all around, the Christian churches all around you, you've got mosques all around you, and you've got the Wailing Wall with all the Jews. It is a pressure cooker, there's no doubt. It is quite an incredible situation that's there. And I don't think it's by accident. I mean, God has set this up. He calls it Jerusalem the burdensome stone. This is something that God is bringing out, and he's testing the nations, and he's testing his own people as to how this is going to play out and how they treat the Jews themselves. I believe you go back, well, we can get to that, but I mean, when you come back to the promises to Abraham, we can see, I think there's a principle that's laid out there. But as we talk about people that have interests in the land, it cannot be mistaken that there's another person that is extremely interested in the land of Israel and was so from the very beginning. This is a book called The Vatican Against Israel, and this is what the guy's name is, Giulio Meotti. He is an Italian journalist, and he writes, "The Pope made clear to Herzl," Herzl was the gentleman that was pushed for the Jews to go back to Israel. He was behind what was called political Zionism, going back to the land of Israel. The Pope made clear, he met with the Pope made clear to him, the existence of a restored Israel in the land of the Bible is proof that they, the Jewish people, is not annihilated, assimilated, and withering away, and is the living refutation of the Christian myth about the Jewish end in the historic process. And this is precisely why the state of Israel has been the most dramatic challenge for the Vatican and the biggest crisis for contemporary Christian theology. It's hard to understand maybe, but if you think about it in this simple way, it's what we call replacement theology. The church fathers for literally over 1,000 years have been saying that the Jews killed Jesus, and therefore in killing Jesus they were destined to be a cursed people and to wander the face of the earth forever. The Jews and that the church themselves have replaced the Jewish people as God's people. That is the essence of replacement theology. If that's the case, we have a problem because the Jews are going back to the land. So all of a sudden, this was a very big problem. It actually carries on, and so the Pope said to Herzl, "I know it's not pleasant to see the Turks who had possession of the Holy Land at that time." He says, "It's not pleasant to see the Turks in possession of our holy places. We simply have to put up with that. But to support the Jews in the acquisition of the holy places, that we cannot do." And Herzl said it was clear that the Vatican was against Britain's Balfour Declaration because of an abhorrence of both Protestantism and Zionism. Avril Manhattan writes in the Vatican-Moscow-Washington alliance, he says, "The specter of the creation of such a theocracy has haunted the inner chambers of the Catholic Church from her earliest inception and is still a dominant fear. Hence her equivocal role in world affairs surrounding the birth of the State of Israel. In Vatican eyes, therefore, the millenarian yearning for a global Hebrew theocracy represents a deadly threat to the eschatological teachings of the Catholic Church. When translated into concrete political terms, such a view spells not only rivalry, but implacable enmity." It just simply, as far as they were concerned, could not happen. And today, folks, unfortunately, it's not really a lot different. There's a different look to it and a different face put on it, but when you look at the detail, the reality is it's not really a whole lot different. This gentleman was Chaim Weizmann, and he was the leader of the Jewish people a little bit further down when they were trying to get the vote passed in the United Nations for the State of Israel. And he wrote, "If the mandate does not go through at this time, it never will. The Catholics have been chiefly responsible for uniting the Muslims and the Christians against us, because what the Vatican really wishes to have is something which amounts to power in Palestine, and it has been using various Catholic members of the League, such as Spain, Brazil, Italy, Belgium, and France, in order to achieve its objective. And this is really the inner meaning of its attacks against us." It was clear to everybody involved in the process that they did not have the support of the Vatican, in fact, quite the opposite. The question is it any different today? This was the gentleman that wrote the Vatican Against Israel, and it was published in 2013. And this is what he says about the Roman Catholic and Israeli relations. He says, "Pro-Palestinian / anti-Israeli rhetoric of the Arab Christian bishops has become a staple of Western clerics, both Catholic and non-Catholic. Their criticism falls into roughly 3 categories: comparing Israeli policies to the Holocaust, comparing Israeli to an apartheid state, comparing the sufferings of the Palestinians to the sufferings of Christ." The truth is, you'd think, come on, that's a bit far-fetched, really. The truth is, folks, that when you actually get into the nuts and bolts of the current crisis, and that is, there's too many people that do not want this crisis to be solved. That's the truth. There's too many people that do not want it to be solved. You know, in 1948, when the Jews proclaimed the state of Israel, the British pulled out and the Jews proclaimed the state of Israel, 870,000 Jews at that point had to flee from the surrounding Arab lands because of fear for their lives. So you had 870,000 refugees that fled into Israel. And at the same time, you had 700,000 refugees that actually moved out of Israel and went to Arab lands. Some of it, there's people debate both ways. Was it of their own volition or what was it? I think it maybe have been a bit of a combination. They were scared of the Jews coming, but at the same time, their own leaders were telling them, just come out, and within a few weeks, we'll have the land cleansed. Don't worry about it. And as we know, it didn't work out that way. The truth is, the 870,000 Jews have been assimilated, no issue, into Israel and have good working lives. The 700,000, there's only actually 30,000 left today, but they have been kept in camps, and the world does not want them to be assimilated. And so what they've done now is said, well, if a refugee, if there's only 30,000 left, that's not a big enough number to worry about. So anybody that's their children or their grandchildren, they are now refugees, and they deserve to come home to Israel as well. But knowing full well that if that happened, it would flood Israel with the numbers, and you would cease to have a Jewish state. But that is honestly what they want. But a lot of times it's very subtle things that go on. And this is what keeps this crisis continually on the back burner, or sometimes right in the middle of it. It's a constant incitement and a constant war to just keep this issue on the forefront. And if they could get the Jews out of what they can term the holy places, get them out of Shiloh, get them out of Jerusalem, get them out of these places, then it would be mission accomplished. And that's simply the fact. This gentleman says this, and he was, Michael Saba was the bishop over the land, just until very recently, actually, in Israel. He says, this land cannot be exclusive for anyone. But see, you think, well, of course, that's not right. That would be racist to say that it's a land for the Jews. Well, as one of the Jewish ambassadors to the UN said recently, if you go and actually look at to the UN and you count the flags, he says there's something like 23 with a cross, there's something like 15 with a crescent, and he said there's one with the Star of David on it for the Jewish people. We have one small land, and we've been a lot of years without a place to be, where we can be free from persecution, and he said, and to be honest, he said that is one too many. But by saying it can't be exclusive for anyone, that means that anybody could move to Israel, meaning the refugees should be able to come back. And this gentleman puts it this way, which is the other angle. The German bishop, made the comparison during a recent visit between Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem, and Ramallah, a city in the West Bank. Hankey said, "This morning we saw pictures of the Warsaw Ghetto at Yad Vashem, and this evening we are going to the Ramallah Ghetto." Now, folks, living the way they do, the Palestinians, as far as I'm concerned, they're pawns in this whole thing that's going on. It is not a situation that anybody would want to be in, but at the same time, to try and compare it to the Warsaw Ghetto is so ridiculous, it is actually blows your mind. The reason there's walls, if you go back, my wife actually went to Israel before I did. Before we were together, she went to Israel, and she was able to drive into Bethlehem. She was able to drive into Nazareth, into all these places that today would be Arab lands. Today, a Jewish car absolutely cannot go into those cities. It is complete lockdown. Now, what changed that? Before, actually, to be honest, if you looked at peace today, we say elusive peace, we're going backwards. Because before, we had a guide when we first went, which is even now maybe 10 years ago, and our guide, when we were going through the old city, he would stop at Arab stalls and buy, he said, the Arabs make the best socks, and he would buy socks, and we would go to Arab places for dinner. And there was, even then, although it was already breaking down, there was a much more connect. The reality is it's going backwards, and the incitement is getting worse and worse. Well, in comparing Ramallah to the Warsaw Ghetto, this was the Warsaw Ghetto. I looked up, I thought, let's just, I'll get a picture. Some of the pictures of the Warsaw Ghetto, I mean, the reality is you're literally loading people into cattle trucks, and we know what the end of it was. It is an outrageous comparison. But you say, well, maybe that's a rogue bishop. I mean, really, we wouldn't actually mean this across. This wouldn't be policy of the Vatican to push this kind of a thing. Well, this is just recently, and this is Pope Francis. He went to Bethlehem, and on the way out, he decided he would stop at the wall and pray. Okay. He knows. You can see here's the cameras. It's literally, if you get a shot from behind, there's just a crowd of cameras around him. He picks the spot. They've got it scribed, ready for him. Bethlehem looked like the Warsaw Ghetto, free Palestine. And he prays there, and the whole media takes all the pictures, gets it all over the world news. This is not accidental. This is an extremely highly publicized visit, and this is where we stop to pray. Folks, this issue that we have when we talk about peace, it is not an issue, I repeat, that anybody that's really involved in a lot of corners, especially here, they do not want this to go away. They will not stop until the Jews are out of the holy places. And when we looked at it last night, this gets to the heart of Ezekiel chapter 38, and we read Joel chapter 3. You're coming against my people Israel. Joel chapter 3 says you're coming against my heritage Israel. It comes up again and again. It is the cornerstone of the prophecies. If you said, why in the prophecies what are they doing? What is this group of nations? Why are they coming against Israel? Why are they invading Israel? It does mention a spoil, and of course, in this world today, economy is always plays a part of it. I'm sure Russia today and going into Syria, oil may have something to do with it. I wouldn't be at all surprised. Some people say it is, and it very well may be. Going down into Israel is going to have some benefits economically to this northern group of nations, but at the heart of it, there is a deep-rooted anti-Semitism. And this deep-rooted anti-Semitism is something that God will only, as we saw last night, take for so long. This was, I got this picture. This was Bethlehem today. So stars and bucks. So I know it's, and I shouldn't really joke, but stars and bucks, it's true they don't have Starbucks, but they have a close second. And the two Mercedes, I didn't take this picture, I just got this, I just Googled Bethlehem, and this was one of the pictures that came up, and it was two choice. The reality is, as I say, for the Palestinian people, this is not a great scenario. This is not a good situation. A lot of them would love to leave Israel. A lot of them would love to get out of there and go back and be joined to family. They're not allowed to go. The list of things you have to have in place as a Palestinian to be able to leave ensures that you will be coming back. It is, it's quite a situation. So the reality is, I haven't given you anything that makes us feel any more excited about the situation today. But the truth is, there is an answer, and there is an answer in the Scriptures. And let's go back to Genesis. If you've got your Scriptures with you, your Bible, Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1. Now the Lord said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house into a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and will bless thee, and make thy name great. And thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So in because of Abraham's faith, as we read through the Scriptures, he obeys God, he leaves his family in Ur of the Chaldees, and he goes out. And as we go through the promises, we don't have time to really look at them actually, but it goes forward to Genesis chapter 13, and it goes forward to Genesis chapter 15. We could go through all of them. Let's just jump to Genesis 15 and verse 18. God says to him, In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. So God promises this land that we're talking about tonight. He's promised it to Abraham. And what we read further, when we read tonight from 2 Samuel chapter 7, is incredible, because those promises to Abraham give us this much detail. Then when you go forward to the promises to David, God updates us and gives us even more detail. We don't have the time to go through it all tonight, but clearly it's given us more. Let's just read this here, verse 12. And when thy days be fulfilled, thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, and I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. So it's now talking about specifically, it says, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels. I will establish his kingdom. So it's not just the seed in general, it's a specific person. And he says, verse 13, he shall build an house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So David, this kingdom of yours that your seed's going to sit on is going to last forever. Verse 14, I will be his father, and he shall be my son. So not only that, like what? David's sitting there going, my seed that comes down, in my generations, there's going to be a specific person that is also your son, God? God says David, he's going to be your seed, but he's going to be my son as well. David's mind is like he's blown, and David is and verse 16, and thy house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee. David, not only that, you're going to see it. These are incredible things. It's said in the New Testament that the gospel was preached before to Abraham. Abraham was preached the gospel. The gospel means the good news. The good news was preached to Abraham. What good news did Abraham get? That there was going to be a land, that his seed was promised, and as we go forward, there's more detail given and more detail given. It's a beautiful thing. We don't have time. Time is always against me. But if we go through Deuteronomy chapter 28, you get a list of blessings. Israel, if you follow me and do what I want, this is going to happen to you, and it's beautiful, bunch of promises, yeah? If you don't obey me, this is going to happen to you. And this is going to happen to you is you're going to be scattered, it's going to be a terrible time. The reality, folks, is I'm human, you're human, they were human. They couldn't live up to the standard God requested. Just truth. Not saying I would do any better, they didn't. And the truth was God cut them out of the land and said, enough's enough, and he scattered them, we know the time of AD 70. Now, many people, as we talked about, wanted to leave it there and say, the Jews killed Jesus. Enough of that. Now we've replaced them. Aren't we feeling good? This is great. Folks, that is not the end of the story, and yet at the same time, it was God was the one that instigated this to happen, because he says in Ezekiel chapter 36, he says, not for your sakes, O house of Israel, not because the Jews are an incredible people in and of themselves, he says, but for my holy name's sake. I promised to Abraham I was going to do it. I promised to David that I was going to do it. And let me tell you something, I'm going to do it. So I'm going to take this people, and what they never were before, I'm going to make them now, and that is a holy nation. The most exciting things that are going on in this world revolve around this nation. We live in a time when the thought of divine intervention is bizarre. It is the things of Star Wars. It simply isn't something really we've ever experienced, other than when we look at prophecy. Through the eye of prophecy, we can see God working in the nations. We can see these things going on. The whole reason that God brought these people back to the land was for a purpose, and was because of his, as I say, his holy namesake. Come to Jeremiah chapter 31. There's a number of prophecies we could look at that show this. But if we're going to look at peace in the Middle East, and we're going to look at the events, we're doing it through the Bible tonight, and when we do, it puts a totally different view of things. Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 7. For thus saith the Lord, Sing with gladness for Jacob, Jeremiah 31, verse 7. Sing for gladness for Jacob, and shout among the chief of the nations. Publish ye, praise ye, and say, O Lord, save thy people, the remnant of Israel. Behold, I will bring them from the north country, and gather them from the coasts, or the RV says, the uttermost parts of the earth, and with them the blind and the lame, the woman with child, and her that travaileth with child together. A great company shall return thither. They shall come with weeping, and with supplications will I lead them. I will cause them to walk by the rivers of waters, and by the straight way, wherein they shall not stumble. For I am a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. Hear the word of the Lord, O ye nations, and declare it in the isles afar off, and say, He that scattered Israel will gather him, and keep him as a shepherd doth his flock. This is what's going on. God has brought his people back to the land, and as much as today the world rejects the Bible, equally the world rejects his people. And we don't have time tonight to get into the intimate details of the rights and wrongs of the conflict, but the truth is, God is the one behind what's going on in the land. God is the one that's brought the people back, and he's the one that's brought them back, as he says, to my mountains, as we read last night. My land and my mountains, says God. The Dead Sea Scrolls, it's very interesting. The Dead Sea Scrolls are amazing because if you want to prove to somebody and say, and talk about the Bible, the easiest thing that they can say is, oh, but do you actually believe that over 2,000 years or more that you have a text in front of you that's not corrupted? I mean, come on, that's ridiculous. It wasn't even written in English. You've had it passed down, and the translations are going to get lost. Who even knows? It's such an easy thing to do, and it was an easy thing to do until people started digging and people started finding things. And the thing is, I love the way God works. I love it. I mean, God's timing sometimes is too perfect. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found by an Arab boy, and he threw rocks into a cave, and he heard a smash of a jar, and the end of the story was they found these Dead Sea Scrolls. They date back to before Christ, and they are the book of Isaiah, and they are virtually word for word to what we have today. So if somebody wants to say, well, the text is corrupted, guaranteed you can at least go to the book of Isaiah, because every little bit of it, we've got proof that it was there right from before Christ. And when do we find this? It is I'm quoting here, it is most remarkable that the Isaiah manuscript 2, which was part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, was purchased by Yigal Yadin's father, Eleazar, professor of archaeology at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, on the very day the UN voted on the establishment of a Jewish state, an important event that led to the Declaration of the Independence in 1948. Literally, the guy, the scroll had been passed around, and this Jewish guy got word of it and went, we've got to get our hands on it. He's able to purchase it, and he's laying it out on the day that the UN is voting on the state of Israel. And not only that, the guy we saw before, Chaim Weitzman is his name, he was the one, and he read out this verse in the United Nations, and it was right from the book of Isaiah. And he read, and it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people which shall be left from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam, from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea. And he shall set up an ensign for the nations and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Those words were read out to the United Nations, and then they voted on whether there was to be a state or not. And at the same time, we've dug up the scroll and found the scroll and are rolling it out, and God says, there it is. My holy namesake, I said it was going to happen, and I said it in the book of Isaiah, and here it is, and it was happening. Now, we could go through many prophecies, but just come to Hosea. If you want to listen, that's okay. The minor prophets, as we call them, can be a little bit hard to find them. But Hosea chapter 3 and verse 4 For the children of Israel shall abide many days without a king, and without a prince, and without a sacrifice, and without an image, and without an ephod, and without teraphim. In other words, they're going to last for a long time without. Those are the things to do with the temple. They're going to be for a long time without. But afterwards shall the children of Israel return. Number one. See, now there's phases here. Number one, they're going to return and seek the Lord their God, and it says, David there, seek the Lord their God and David their king, and shall fear the Lord in his goodness in the latter days. Expect them to go back, expect them to seek, and then expect them to fear God. And it's a process, and for anybody that's learning from the Bible, it's a process. It's not an overnight situation. And here it is the same thing. Now, the incredible thing is, folks, is that all this was written down before. This was from the 1600s. These things were expected. Shall they return to Jerusalem again, says Thomas Brightman? There is nothing more certain. The prophets do everywhere confirm it and beat upon it. The prophets don't shut up about it. All they want to talk about is the Jews going back. And Thomas Brightman is loving it. And so was Sir Isaac Newton. He talks about the Jews going back in all the different places, Daniel, Revelation, Matthew, Ezekiel. He says, the manner of how it's going to happen, he says, I know not. Let time be the interpreter. I don't know how it's going to happen, he says, but we'll find out. It's going to happen. That was in 1733. Alexander Keith, he says, these prophecies, exclusive of many others, need no comment. They declare as clearly as language can that the Jews shall return to Judea. Grattan Guinness, the climax of the Jewish Renaissance is, as we know, to consist in their restoration as a nation to the land of Palestine, a climax which has not yet come, but which is perceptibly nearer than it was even a quarter of a century ago. He goes, it is happening. This is starting to happen. This is back in the 1800s. Edward Elliot, and he tells us there's going to be the occurrence of two grand events that are going to happen. He says, first, the homeward return of the Jews from their dispersion. Second, the gathering and destruction, probably in Judea, of some great anti-Jewish confederacy, which was our talk last night. These things have been looked for. This isn't new, the things we're saying tonight. They are of old, but people have been looking for them for hundreds of years, if not longer. And John Thomas says the following, and John Thomas was actually the gentleman that, through his understanding of the Scriptures and his reading of the Scriptures and his writings of the Scriptures, actually spawned the Christadelphians, and we came from that time. And it was from his teachings where a lot of our beliefs came from, and that the work that he did to dig up from all of Christianity some of the things that he did. But he says the following, there is then a partial and primary restoration of the Jews before the manifestation. The manifestation means the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. There's going to be a partial and primary restoration, which is to serve as the nucleus, the center, the heart of the future operations in the restoration of the rest of the tribes after he has appeared in the kingdom. The pre-adventual colonization, in other words, before Christ, the colonization of Palestine will be purely on political principles, and the Jewish colonists will return in unbelief of the messiahship of Jesus. They're going to go back, they're not going to believe in Jesus, they're not going back for religious reasons, they're simply going back to farm some land and have a place of their own. And of the truth as it is in him, they will emigrate thither as agriculturists and traders in the hope of ultimately establishing their own commonwealth. That is exactly what happens. We don't have the time. He actually goes forward and says it's going to be Britain that's going to help them do it. And certainly it was. And they came back. And this is the incredible thing. This is the incredible thing, because not only did it say it was going to happen, it was said far in advance, and people looked for it, and it happened. And it did come on the back of the Holocaust. It did come out of the incredible events that we saw in World War II. And the truth is, it has continued to grow and grow and grow. The problem has. The Zionism today is a bigger issue than it ever has been. And now, much to the irritation of the world, it's now turning and has a much more religious element to it. Because the people that are going back today and the ones that are in the land today are not all just saying it's on purely political principles. They're reading the prophecies now the same as you and I tonight are reading the prophecies and saying, Oh my word, this is happening to our people after thousands of years of scattering and dispersion. This is happening, and they can see God's hand in it. This is what the world seems to hate more than anything, and that is Jewish building in the land. And the Jews' building is not something that, to be honest, when you go through Scripture, nobody's ever liked it. The time of Ezra and Nehemiah, when the Jews returned back to build, it was detested and hated and fought against desperately. It's always been the case, and much the same as the world hates the Bible itself. John Thomas again said the following: "It may be remarked here that there will have been a considerable gathering of Israelites upon the mountains of Israel before the invasion of the country by Gog and his capture of Jerusalem. This appears from the Spirit's address to Gog in the 8th verse of this chapter, Ezekiel 38. It's exactly what we looked at last night, and this is what specifically John Thomas was looking for. Jews back in, the Holy Land is good. Jews in the mountains of Israel, now it's getting juicy. This is where we are, this is what we're looking for. And now when you look at any of the things that are going on today when they discuss Israel, the rest of Israel, they don't really concern themselves with, but Jews in the heartlands of Israel, this is the nub of the issue. This is the problem. And this is what is turning into be more and more the world's problem. The Temple Institute, look at this. This is when you walk through the old city, this is what you find now. You're walking along in the Jewish quarter, and this is what you find. It's the Temple Institute, and it says on the bottom here, this lampstand, the first golden menorah constructed since the destruction of the Holy Temple. They're not just now happy to be back in the land. Let's read what they say. I just took this off their website last week. The Institute is dedicated to every aspect of the biblical commandment to build the Holy Temple of God on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. Our short-term goal is to rekindle the flame of the Holy Temple in the hearts of mankind through education. Our long-term goal is to do all in our limited power to bring about the building of the Holy Temple in our time. The problem is we revert back to, for the Vatican, this is red rag to a bull. It's bad to have you back in the land because our church fathers are not happy. It's looking wrong. To have you back in the land talking about rebuilding temples, to be trying to build menorahs and do all this stuff, this is now it's gonna get worse. Now, by every means, if you want to see anti-Semitism today, spend a little time around the UN, and it is ludicrous.
I now give the floor to a representative of United Nations Watch.
Thank you, Mr. President. 6 decades ago, in the aftermath of the Nazi horrors, Eleanor Roosevelt, René Cassin, and other eminent figures gathered here on the banks of Lake Geneva to reaffirm the principle of human dignity. They created the Commission on Human Rights. Today we ask, what has become of this noble dream? In this session, we see the answer. Faced with compelling reports from around the world of torture, persecution, and violence against women, what has this council pronounced? What has it decided? Nothing. Its response has been silence. Its response has been indifference. Its response has been criminal. One might say, in Harry Truman's words, that this has become a do-nothing, good-for-nothing council. But that would be inaccurate. This council has, after all, done something. It has enacted one resolution after another, condemning one single state, Israel, in 8 pronouncements, and there will be 3 more this session. Hamas and Hezbollah have been granted impunity. The entire rest of the world, millions upon millions of victims in 191 countries, continue to go ignored. So yes, this council has done something, and the Middle East dictators who orchestrate this campaign will tell you it is a very good thing, and that they seek to protect human rights, Palestinian rights. So too, the racist murderers of Darfur women, the rapists of Darfur women, tell us they care about the rights of Palestinian women. The occupiers of Tibet care about the occupied, and the butchers of Muslims in Chechnya care about Muslims. But do these self-proclaimed defenders truly care about Palestinian rights? Let us consider the past few months. more than 130 Palestinians were killed by Palestinian forces. This is 3 times the combined total that were the pretext for calling special sessions in July and November. Yet the champions of Palestinian rights, Ahmadinejad, Assad, Gaddafi, John Dugard, say nothing. Little 3-year-old boy Salam Balusha and his 2 brothers were murdered in their car by Prime Minister Haniyeh's troops. Why has this council chosen silence? Because Israel could not be blamed. Because, in truth, the despots who run this council couldn't care less about Palestinians or about any human rights. They seek to demonize Israeli democracy, to delegitimize the Jewish state, to scapegoat the Jewish people. They also seek something else, to distort and pervert the very language and idea of human rights. You ask, what has become of the founder's dream, of Eleanor Roosevelt, of René Cassin, of John Humphrey, P.C. Chang, Charles Malik, who assembled here in Geneva 60 years ago? Mr. President, with terrible lies and moral inversion, this council is turning that dream into a nightmare. Thank you, Mr. President.
Por primera vez,
For the first time in the session, I will not express thanks for that statement. I shall point out to the distinguished representative of the organization that just spoke, the distinguished representative of United Nations Watch. If you'd kindly listen to me. I am sorry that I'm not in a position to thank you for your statement. I should mention that I will not tolerate any similar statements in the Council. The way in which members of this Council were referred to, and indeed the way in which the Council itself was referred to, all of this is inadmissible. In the memory of the persons that you referred to, founders of the Human Rights Commission, and for the good of human rights, I would urge you in any future statements to observe some minimum proper conduct and language. Otherwise, any statement you make in similar tones to those used today will be taken out of the records.
That's the reality, guys. It is unbelievable, and I could play you 5 more. That's the reality of what is happening. But the truth is, Zionism is not going away. It is God's work. And the crisis is only going to get more and more and more. It's coming to a head, and the truth is, it's actually kind of exciting, because the end of these prophecies are the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. But as it gets closer and closer, I think that, for me, it is something that is a little sobering, because it makes me want to examine myself. And when I say that the issues are going to get more and more, you can see that this issue of Zionism, this issue of God's people coming back into the land, is going to get more and more to the forefront, especially when you see the next gentleman, because you can see how much the world likes it when Israel builds, when Israel has this, when these things go on. And this next gentleman, if we can... it's just an audio clip, it's all I could get, but his name is Daniel Luria. He's the executive director of Jerusalem Reclamation Project. Now, honestly, I mean, you put your mind into the UN, and then you read the prophecies, and then you listen to somebody like this, and you think, oh, wow, this is how, you can see how the world is going to react to this type of a thing.
The mountain behind the Mount of Olives, only a few hundred meters away, of course, not in the middle of the desert, is only a few minute drive from the old city, is today called Kidmat Zion, east of Zion. That empty block of land, which is at the edge of Jerusalem, in the 1920s, 210 Jews bought 170 acres of land. Official title, no question. 70% of that land is today outside the borders of Jerusalem, and the Arabs have built illegally the village of Abu Dis. That we don't deal at the moment. We're only concerned at the moment what's happening inside the borders of Jerusalem. Of the 30% that remains inside the borders, we hope to build a Jewish neighborhood of 300 odd units. Today there are 6 families living there today as the beginning of the Jewish neighborhood, waiting for approvals, and eventually that will also happen. Because, you see, we follow a certain roadmap that we call God's roadmap. All the other roadmaps from the quartets, from the European Union, United Nations, it means nothing. They can scream today till tomorrow that Jerusalem should be divided, that there should be a two-state solution. I have a message for the world, and that message is that God's roadmap is what decides. We are in the part of the redemption process, and nothing is going to stop it. There are ups and downs. Yes, we have terrorism. Yes, we maybe have a little bit of a definition problem, how we define ourselves as Jewish people. But understand this. We, the Jewish people, have returned home to the Jewish homeland God gave us, not to be divided, not to be courted, and not to be discussed by the world. If the world doesn't like it, they cannot like it. This belongs to us.
You can imagine how that attitude is going to go down when you say to people, well, we're doing this because it's the promises of God, it is because of we're following God's roadmap. It is going to only further inflame the conflict. God, in his foreknowledge, knew it would be the case. And if we turn to Luke chapter, well, let's go to Acts, actually. We read this last night. I'm just going to read it again. Acts chapter 3. Verse 19, we read it last night, I think it's just as relevant for tonight. Repent ye therefore and be converted, that your sins may be blotted out, when the times of refreshing shall come from the presence of the Lord. And he shall send Jesus Christ, which before was preached unto you, whom the heavens must receive until the times of the restoration of all things, which God hath spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began. Jesus Christ is held in heaven until the times of the restoration of all things. Come to Daniel, the prophecy of Daniel chapter 2. We didn't look at this prophecy these last two talks, but it's also very relevant, and we're going to read just from verse 44. And it's the list of, it goes through the different nations until it comes to the time of the end. But verse 44, and in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. It is through this kingdom that God is promised will come, that true peace will come on this earth. The issues that are happening in Israel, the issues that are happening in the Middle East, are not solvable by men. We look today at the issues of ISIS, and I think that prophetically it may be that Russia takes care of ISIS for a while. But will Russia bring peace? Russia will not bring peace. The Confederacy of Nations that is going to get together, as we saw in the article last night, the Grand Confederacy. Will the Grand Confederacy bring peace? It will not bring peace. And neither will it ever accept Jews in Israel, and especially on the mountains of Israel. When gentlemen like Daniel Luria start reading their Bibles as Jews and realizing that it's God's work to put them back in the land and start working toward that goal, it further inflames the process. True peace will come. And even Ishmael, the son of Abraham that from which the Arabs come from, is promised in Genesis chapter 21, verse 18, that he would too be a great nation. Through this process of restoration, not only Israel will be blessed, but all the world. Christ back in the land, the Lord Jesus Christ back in the land, is the answer to all these issues. And different tribes and different people that have forever been seemingly in conflict will actually come very close and be very and support each other in these last days and in the days of this kingdom that is promised here in Daniel chapter 2. These are exciting things, folks, and I believe that from the prophecies and from the things that are going on, we are actually closer than we've ever been before. And again, it is something, as I said last night, if you want to discuss with me any further, if you have any questions or want to go through any of this, I would be more than happy to. Thank you.